The moment the chair scraped across the floor, the story was already being rewritten. A teacher said she felt threatened. A word was spoken that carries weight, consequence, and permission. And in seconds, a quiet classroom transformed into a crime scene built entirely on perception. This is not a story about a student losing control. It's about a 17-year-old who understood, long before that day, that survival sometimes means standing perfectly still. Hands visible. Voice swallowed. Body frozen while fear spoke for someone else. As authority closed in and a narrative hardened into law, one boy became a threat without moving an inch. But somewhere above the chaos, unnoticed and indifferent to panic, a camera was recording. And while voices escalated and assumptions calcified, it captured something far more dangerous to the story being told: the truth. The sound of the chair scraping against the linoleum floor was the only warning before the atmosphere in the room shattered completely. It was a sharp, guttural noise, like a bone snapping, and it marked the exact moment the narrative began to twist. Mrs. Albright was backing away, her hands raised in a performative surrender that felt rehearsed, her back colliding with the whiteboard ledge. Dust from the eraser tray puffed into the air, dancing in the harsh, flickering light of the overhead fluorescents, but nobody was watching the dust. Every pair of eyes in the AP history classroom was fixed on Jordan. He was standing by his desk, his posture rigid, his hands clearly visible and empty, hovering near his waist in a gesture of absolute passivity. Yet, the air in the room had curdled with a sudden, manufactured terror. The teacher's voice was high and trembling, a frequency that scraped against the nerves of everyone present, as she announced to the room, and to the hallway beyond, that she felt threatened. She used that specific word, weaponizing it with a precision that betrayed the chaos in her eyes. Threatened. The word hung in the sterile air, heavy and suffocating. Jordan could feel the weight of it settling on his shoulders, a familiar and crushing burden that he had been trained to anticipate since he was old enough to walk to the corner store alone. He did not move. He barely breathed. He knew, with a terrifying clarity that defied his 17 years, that any movement now would be interpreted as aggression. If he reached for his backpack to get the assignment she had asked for, it would be a weapon. If he took a step forward to explain, it would be an advance. So he became a statue, freezing his body in time, forcing his heart rate to decouple from the adrenaline flooding his veins. The sensory details of the room became agonizingly sharp. He could smell the stale coffee on the teacher's desk, the metallic tang of the radiator in the corner, and the faint, acrid scent of fear that seemed to emanate not from him, but from the woman who held his future in her trembling hands. The silence that followed her accusation was loud, filled with the scratching of pencils that had stopped moving and the shifting of 25 other bodies in their seats. They were waiting for the monster to appear, the caricature of the violent black male that had been painted for them by 1,000 news cycles and television dramas. But the monster was not there. There was only a boy, wearing a gray hoodie and faded jeans, terrified that his silence would not be enough to save him. He watched Mrs. Albright reach for the phone on the wall, her fingers fumbling with the keypad as she dialed the front office. He heard her whisper, loud enough for the front row to hear, that she needed security immediately. That there was a situation. That she was afraid for her safety. The injustice of it burned behind Jordan's eyes, a hot, prickly sensation that demanded release, but he swallowed it down. He swallowed the scream that wanted to tear through his throat. He swallowed the urge to plead his case. He knew the rules of this game. In this moment, truth was secondary to her perception. Her fear, however irrational, was the governing law of the classroom. He focused on the texture of the desk beside him, the fake wood grain peeling at the edges, grounding himself in the physical reality of the moment to keep from dissociating. He counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3. He could hear the heavy footsteps approaching down the hallway before the door even opened. The cadence of authority. The rhythmic thud of boots that meant enforcement was coming. When the school resource officer burst through the door, hand already resting on the holster at his hip, the energy in the room spiked. The officer saw what he was conditioned to see: a teacher in distress and a black male student standing the center of the room. The context did not matter. The fact that Jordan had not moved a muscle did not matter. The narrative had already been written by the teacher's phone call. The officer barked a command, aggressive and loud, demanding Jordan put his hands on his head. Jordan moved slowly, telegraphing every inch of motion, his eyes locked on the floor to avoid any perceived defiance. He could feel the eyes of his classmates burning into him, rewriting his identity in real time. To them, he was no longer the quiet kid who sat in the third row and aced his history tests. He was a threat. He was a danger. He was a problem to be solved with handcuffs and suspension. The officer spun him around, the force unnecessary and performative, pushing him against the wall. The cold plaster pressed against his cheek, a stark contrast to the heat rising in his face. As the handcuffs clicked shut, biting into the skin of his wrists, Jordan felt a profound sense of isolation. It was as if he were drowning in plain sight, screaming for help in a language no one else could hear. But there was one witness in the room that was not swayed by fear or bias. High in the corner of the room, nestled in a tinted plastic dome that gathered dust and went largely unnoticed, the unblinking eye of the surveillance camera was recording. It captured the stillness of the boy. It captured the distance between him and the teacher. It captured the lack of aggression, the open palms, the terrified compliance. It was silently archiving the truth, frame by frame, storing the receipts that would later shatter the lies being spun in that very moment. Jordan didn't know it yet, as he was marched out of the classroom past the gawking faces of his peers, but that silent mechanical witness was the only thing standing between him and the destruction of his future. The camera hummed quietly, a digital guardian in a world of analog prejudice, waiting for someone to press play. The walk from the classroom to the administrative office is a journey measured not in distance but in the rapid disintegration of dignity, a corridor of shame where the echoes of footsteps sound like the closing of prison doors. Jordan walked in the center of the hallway, flanked by the school resource officer whose hand hovered perpetually near his belt, a gesture of readiness for a violence that existed only in the officer's imagination. To the casual observer, or perhaps to the students peering through the narrow windows of their classroom doors, the scene looked like a dangerous offender being escorted to justice. But inside Jordan's chest, his heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, a frantic rhythm that contradicted the stone-faced mask he had practiced wearing since he was 6 years old. He knew the rules of this engagement better than he knew the periodic table or the dates of the Civil War. He knew that to stumble was to resist, to speak was to aggravate, and to cry was to admit guilt. He had to become a vessel of absolute zero, devoid of temperature or temper, just to survive the transit from one room to another. This is the first installment of the price he pays for existence, a surcharge levied on his adrenaline and his peace of mind. Upon arriving at the main office, the atmosphere shifted from the kinetic tension of the hallway to the suffocating stagnation of a waiting room designed to intimidate. The secretary behind the high counter did not look up, her typing assuming a furious, rhythmic cadence that seemed to purposefully ignore his presence. Jordan was directed to a hard, plastic chair in the corner, positioned so that anyone entering or exiting the principal's office would have to step around his outstretched legs. This was the theater of discipline. He sat with his backpack on his lap, hugging it against his chest like a shield, his fingers white-knuckling the straps. The air conditioning hummed with a sterile, mechanical indifference, circulating air that smelled of toner and floor wax. In this silence, the gravity of the accusation began to settle over him. They said he was aggressive. They said he lunged. They said they feared for their safety. He replayed the memory of the last 10 minutes on a loop, searching for the moment he had become a monster, but all he could find was his own confusion and the sudden, sharp scent of the teacher's fear sweat when she started screaming at him. This gap between his reality and their perception is the essence of the black tax. It is often discussed in economic terms, referring to the financial support successful black professionals provide to extended families, but there is a more insidious, emotional currency at play here. The black tax, in the context of the American school system, is the cognitive overhead required to navigate spaces that view you as a liability. It is the exhaustion of constantly auditing your own existence. It is the energy spent calculating the trajectory of your glance, the volume of your voice, and the speed of your movements to ensure they cannot be weaponized against you. Jordan was currently paying this tax with interest. He was sitting in a plastic chair, doing absolutely nothing, yet he was working harder than anyone else in the building. He was working to contain his terror so it wouldn't be misread as anger. He was working to suppress his indignation so it wouldn't be documented as insubordination. He was paying for the comfort of the staff with the currency of his own childhood. While he waited for the principal's door to open, a deeper dread began to take root, the dread of the phone call home. This is the secondary loop of the trauma. It wasn't just that he was in trouble, it was that his parents would now be drafted into this war, forced to leave their jobs, forced to swallow their own pride, forced to come down to this school and beg for fairness in a system designed to ration it. He looked at the clock on the wall, the second hand sweeping past the numbers with agonizing slowness. He realized then that this event wasn't an anomaly. It was a syllabus. The school was trying to teach him a lesson, but it wasn't about conduct or respect. It was a lesson about his place in the hierarchy of credibility. But what the administration didn't account for, and what Jordan himself couldn't yet see, was that the lesson was incomplete. There were three distinct pillars of survival that he had been unconsciously building his entire life: defensive excellence, code switching, and the accumulation of receipts. These were the tools that would eventually dismantle the lie they were currently writing about him. Before we press play on that surveillance footage and watch the narrative collapse, we have to understand these three pillars, because the camera didn't save Jordan in a vacuum. It merely confirmed what his soul already knew. The fluorescent hum of the library on a Tuesday evening was the only sound Jordan allowed himself to hear for 3 years. He sat at the corner table, the one furthest from the entrance, arranging his pens in a precise, militant line parallel to the edge of his notebook. This ritual was not born of compulsion but of necessity, a small, tangible manifestation of the first pillar of his survival, the defense of excellence. For Jordan, and for so many young black men navigating spaces that were not designed to hold them, excellence was not merely a pursuit of academic accolades or intellectual vanity. It was a shield. It was a heavy, suffocating suit of armor welded together by straight as, perfect attendance records, and a modulation of tone that stripped every sentence of potential aggression. The world had told him, through subtle glances and overt warnings from his parents, that he did not have the luxury of mediocrity. To be average was to be invisible, but to be invisible was dangerous because it allowed others to project their fears onto the blank canvas of his identity. So he chose visibility through perfection, believing that if his transcript was unimpeachable, his character would be too. He was operating under the tragic assumption that logic ruled the hearts of prejudiced institutions, that a high grade point average could purchase immunity from the assumption of guilt. This was the defense of excellence, the exhausting, unending labor of proving you belong in a room you have already entered. Every morning before he walked through the double doors of the school, Jordan engaged in a psychological calibration that his white peers could scarcely imagine. He checked his uniform to ensure it was beyond critique, not a thread out of place, because he knew that for him, a sloppy tie wasn't just a dress code violation, it was interpreted as a sign of disrespect or a lack of upbringing. He participated in class with a calculated precision, raising his hand slowly, speaking in complete paragraphs, and modulating the bass in his voice to ensure it never rumbled with anything that could be misconstrued as hostility. This was the tax he paid for his seat in the classroom. He believed that if he curated an image of the perfect scholar, he would cease to be the terrifying black male. He thought he could outwork the bias. But the defense of excellence is a fragile fortress. It requires a flawless performance every single second of every single day, because the margin for error is non-existent. A single slipped grade, a moment of fatigue, or a flash of genuine frustration could shatter years of carefully constructed armor. The tragedy, of course, is that this excellence does not actually dismantle the fear held by the staff. Often, it exacerbates it. To an observer looking for a threat, Jordan's silence wasn't seen as studious focus, it was seen as brooding. His stoicism wasn't read as discipline, it was read as cold detachment. The very tools he used to protect himself, his stillness, his quiet capability, were being twisted into evidence of a hidden danger. They feared him not because he was failing, but because he was unknowable to them, and his excellence made him powerful in a way that disrupted their expected hierarchy. There is a specific kind of loneliness that comes with this defense. Jordan could not share the burden with his teachers, for they were the ones grading his performance, and he could not fully share it with his friends, for fear of seeming paranoid or overly serious. He existed in a silo of high expectations, carrying the weight of his family's hopes and the burden of his race's representation on shoulders that were still growing. When the administration later claimed they felt unsafe around him, they were reacting to a phantom they had created, ignoring the reality of the boy standing right in front of them. The boy they feared was actually a young man exhausted by the effort of being perfect. He was tired. His threatening demeanor was actually the fatigue of constant vigilance. He was analyzing every interaction, every hallway movement, every facial expression of the adults around him, calculating the safest path through the day. This hyper-awareness is a hallmark of the defense of excellence. You become a sociologist of your own oppression, constantly gathering data on how to survive the next hour. And yet, despite this monumental effort, the narrative was already being written against him. The staff didn't see the homework meticulously completed at the kitchen table at midnight. They didn't see the polite nods or the held doors. They saw a silhouette that matched a nightmare they had been fed by a culture of fear. They saw a black boy who didn't smile enough to make them comfortable, and in their minds, that lack of subservience was a precursor to violence. They mistook his dignity for defiance. And so, when the pivotal moment arrived, the moment captured on surveillance that we will soon analyze, Jordan fell back on his training. He didn't lash out. He didn't scream. He engaged the defense of excellence one last time. He stood perfectly still. He relied on the truth of his character to save him, unaware that in that specific office, the truth had no currency. The footage would eventually vindicate him, but it would also reveal the heartbreaking futility of his armor. He had done everything right, and they were still afraid. The transition bell between third and fourth period did not signal freedom for Jordan, but rather the commencement of a high-stakes tactical operation. As the classroom door swung open, releasing a cacophony of adolescent energy into the corridor, Jordan paused to calibrate his internal instrument. This specific beat of his existence, the pillar of the internal volume knob, was invisible to every administrator who claimed to fear him. The hallway was a sensory minefield, a narrow artery of the school composed of gray linoleum and fluorescent hum, packed with bodies that felt entitled to the space. Around him, white students engaged in the typical chaotic rituals of high school. They shouted greetings across the heads of their peers, they slammed lockers with theatrical force, and they wrestled playfully near the water fountains. Their volume was interpreted by the staff monitoring the perimeter as spirit, as youth, or simply as noise. But Jordan understood the physics of his own existence differently. He knew that his volume was subject to an entirely different exchange rate. If he were to match the decibel level of the varsity quarterback laughing at a joke 3 feet away, the reaction from the faculty would not be a smile, but a radio call to the resource officer. He had learned through years of subtle conditioning that his joy was perceived as disruption, and his frustration was perceived as danger. So, before his sneaker even crossed the threshold into the hallway, he reached for that mental dial and turned himself down. This is the exhaustion of the internal volume knob. It is the perpetual conscious dampening of one's own humanity to accommodate the fragility of others. Jordan dropped his shoulders to appear smaller than his 6-foot frame. He softened his gaze, unclenching his jaw to ensure his resting face could not be weaponized against him as a sign of aggression. He moved through the crowd with the fluidity of water, slipping between groups without contact, because he knew that in the geometry of school discipline, a collision involving him was never an accident, it was an assault. The staff members stationed at the intersection of the English and math wings watched him approach. In their reports, they would later describe an air of defiance, but what they were actually witnessing was a young man in a state of extreme repression. They saw a student who refused to engage in the boisterous social contract of the hallway, and they interpreted that silence as a gathering storm. They did not understand that Jordan was operating on a frequency of survival. He was muting his colorfulness to blend into the beige walls. He was silencing his bass to avoid vibrating the delicate sensibilities of the adults who held his future in their hands. This act of modulation requires a tremendous amount of cognitive load. While other students were thinking about the upcoming biology test or the weekend football game, Jordan was running a complex background algorithm analyzing his proximity to authority figures, the speed of his gait, and the placement of his hands. He kept his hands visible, always. He kept his pace measured, never running, even if the bell was seconds away from ringing. To run was to flee, and to flee was to invite pursuit. This rigorous self-regulation created a paradox that the surveillance footage would later highlight with painful clarity. The more Jordan tried to make himself safe for them, the more alien he appeared. By stripping away his natural reactions, by turning the volume of his personality down to a near-silent hum, he became a cipher to the staff. They couldn't read him because he had redacted himself for their comfort. In the absence of data, their biases filled in the blanks. Where there was stillness, they hallucinated tension. Where there was silence, they hallucinated a threat. The internal volume knob, designed to protect him, had inadvertently made him a canvas for their darkest projections. He walked past the vice principal, nodding once, a gesture calculated to be respectful but not familiar, and received a stony stare in return. The teacher saw a towering figure refusing to smile. Jordan felt the muscles in his neck straining to hold his head at a non-threatening angle. The tragedy of this dynamic is that it leaves no room for the student to simply exist. There is no off switch, only constant modulation. By the time Jordan reached the administrative office where the incident would take place, his battery was drained. He had spent 6 hours suppressing his natural impulses, shrinking his footprint, and swallowing his voice. When he was finally confronted, when the accusations began to fly, he did not have the energy to explode. The fear the staff claimed to feel was a reaction to a phantom. They were terrified of a frequency Jordan had long since muted. The surveillance footage of the office shows a boy who had turned his volume knob all the way to 0, waiting for the signal that it was safe to be human again. But that signal never came. Instead, the silence he offered as a peace treaty was taken as an act of war. The architecture of Jordan's silence was not built in a day, nor was it constructed solely within the walls of a high school that viewed him as a liability. To understand the stillness observed on the surveillance footage, that unnatural, statue-like composure maintained while adults screamed accusations at him, one must travel back 10 years and 3 miles south to a humid front porch in July. It was here that the foundation was laid, not by a teacher or a peer, but by a man whose survival depended on the mastery of his own gravity. Jordan's grandfather, Elias, was a man of few words and immense presence, a figure carved from the bedrock of a different era. He possessed a stillness that felt heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm, and he recognized early on that his grandson had inherited his height, his breadth, and the perilous visibility that came with them. The lesson was never formally scheduled, but it was taught in the quiet spaces between thunderclaps during summer storms and in the subtle gestures exchanged across the dinner table. It was a curriculum of survival passed down through the bloodline, an intergenerational transfer of defensive tactics disguised as etiquette. There is a specific memory that anchors this discipline, a moment that Jordan replayed in his mind as he sat in the sterile glare of the administrative office. He was 8 years old, standing beside Elias in a hardware store, clutching a handful of galvanized nails he was helping to buy. A clerk, flustered and seemingly agitated by nothing more than their presence in the aisle, had snapped at Elias, accusing the old man of loitering, of blocking the path, of taking up too much space. The accusation was absurd, the aisle was empty, and Elias was motionless. Jordan felt the heat rise in his own chest, a childish, righteous indignation sparking in his throat. He wanted to shout, to point out the unfairness, to defend the giant who held his hand. But then he felt the pressure. Elias's hand, large and rough like coarse sandpaper, squeezed Jordan's shoulder. It was not a squeeze of fear, but a command. A transmission of data. Elias did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He did not frown. He simply became a void. He slowed his breathing until his chest barely moved. He uncurled his fingers so his empty palms were visible. He looked at the clerk not with submission, but with a terrifyingly calm neutrality, waiting for the man's panic to exhaust itself against the cliff face of his dignity. Later, on the drive home, the silence was thick until Elias finally spoke, his voice rumbling against the hum of the engine. He told Jordan that when you are a black man of a certain size, your anger is a luxury you cannot afford. He explained that the world is often frightened by your existence, and it will look for any reason to justify that fear. If you shout, they see a riot. If you wave your hand, they see a weapon. If you panic, they see guilt. The only safe harbor, Elias taught him, is absolute zero. You must learn to swallow the scream until it dissolves in your stomach. You must learn to turn your body into an object of such profound stillness that their fear has nothing to latch onto. This was the inheritance. It was not money or land, but a psychological armor forged in the fires of Jim Crow and polished in the civil rights era, handed down to a boy who would need it in the fluorescent hallways of a modern high school. This was the mentor archetype in its most tragic and necessary form, the elder teaching the youth how to shrink so that they might survive the day. So, when the school staff began to spiral, feeding off each other's anxiety, claiming that Jordan looked threatening, they were not seeing a boy on the verge of violence. They were seeing a boy channeling his grandfather. The surveillance footage, which the administration hoped would corroborate their story of a dangerous aggressor, instead captured a seance. Jordan sat in the hard plastic chair with his feet flat on the floor, exactly as Elias had shown him. His hands were folded in his lap, fingers interlaced, palms exposed to show he held no weapon, no malice, no resistance. His eyes were fixed on a point on the wall, refusing to engage in the volatile exchange of glares that might be misinterpreted as defiance. To the untrained eye, he looked detached, perhaps even cold. But the camera captured the truth of the lineage. Every muscle in his body was contracted in a supreme effort of will. He was holding back a tidal wave of teenage frustration, confusion, and fear, filtering it all through the discipline his grandfather had engaged. The staff's fear was escalating because Jordan refused to give them the reaction they needed to justify their own panic. They wanted a monster, but he gave them a monk. He was implementing a survival strategy that was 3 generations deep, proving that the greatest threat in the room was not the student who had mastered himself, but the adults who had lost control of their own imaginations. The conference room where the reckoning finally arrived was airless, a glass-walled aquarium of bureaucracy where the hum of the ventilation system seemed to underscore the silence of the 6 adults seated around the mahogany table. It was 3 days after the incident, 3 days during which the official narrative had ossified into a document filled with terrifying adjectives. The written report, resting in the center of the table like a loaded weapon, utilized words such as belligerent, aggressive posturing, and imminent threat to describe Jordan's behavior in the hallway. These words had already begun the machinery of expulsion, triggering a sequence of administrative levers designed to remove a danger from the educational environment. But today, the atmosphere was different because the abstraction of written language was about to collide with the absolute objectivity of pixels. The principal sat at the head of the table, his hand hovering over the remote control for the wall-mounted monitor, while Jordan's parents sat opposite him, their posture rigid, their faces masks of exhausted patience. They had demanded the footage. They had insisted on the receipts. And now, the room dimmed, the screen flickered to life, and the timestamp in the upper right corner began its relentless march forward, dragging the truth out of the shadows of memory and into the harsh, undeniable light of the present. When the video began to play, the first thing that struck the room was the silence of the medium itself. Without audio, the scene was stripped of the verbal escalations and tonal inflections that the staff had relied upon to justify their fear. What remained was a study in physical geometry, a choreography of bodies that told a story radically different from the one on paper. The camera, mounted high in the corner of the hallway, provided a wide-angle view that captured the entire ecosystem of the confrontation. On the screen, the staff members appeared frantic, their movements jerky and invasive. They were the ones closing the distance, their arms waving, their fingers pointing, their bodies encroaching on the personal space of a student who was backed against a row of lockers. The visual evidence was jarring because it immediately inverted the accusations. The report claimed Jordan had lunged. The video showed him retreating until there was nowhere left to go. The report claimed he was flailing. The video showed his hands visible, palms open, resting near his waist in a universal gesture of surrender. The grainy black and white footage acted as a truth serum, dissolving the hallucinations of fear that had gripped the adults in that hallway. It stripped away the psychological filters of the observers, leaving only the raw mechanics of who moved, who advanced, and who stood their ground. As the footage continued to roll, the stillness of the boy in the frame became the loudest thing in the room. This was the receipt. This was the moral victory made visible. Jordan stood with an eerie, statue-like composure amidst the swirl of administrative panic. He was implementing the lesson of the generations before him, understanding that any sudden movement, any twitch of irritation, could be weaponized against him. The viewers in the conference room watched as he deliberately lowered his chin, avoiding direct eye contact not out of guilt, but out of a survival instinct to de-escalate a situation he did not create. The contrast was devastating to the school's narrative. The staff members on screen looked like they were fighting a phantom, reacting to a monster that existed only in their minds, while the boy in front of them stood with the stoicism of a monk. The juxtaposition was so sharp it was almost embarrassing to witness. The fear they had reported was real, but the video proved that the source of that fear was not Jordan's actions, but their own internal projections. They had looked at a teenage boy and seen a threat, and then they had behaved as if that threat were real, creating a chaotic feedback loop that Jordan refused to participate in. In the dim light of the conference room, the shifting in seats became audible. The shifting of papers ceased. The principal paused the video at the exact moment the report claimed the physical intimidation was at its peak. The freeze frame showed Jordan standing still, his back flush against the metal locker, while two adults towered over him, invading his cylinder of space. The image was undeniable. It was a portrait of restraint in the face of provocation. The moral victory here was not just that Jordan had followed the rules, it was that he had possessed the emotional intelligence to manage the emotions of the adults around him. He had become the thermostat while they were the thermometers, rising and falling with their own panic. The receipts proved that the only person in the hallway who had maintained professional control was the child. The video did not just exonerate him, it indicted the system that had so quickly moved to condemn him. The silence that followed the end of the clip was heavy, filled with the unspoken realization that the narrative of the dangerous black male student had been dismantled frame by frame, leaving behind only the uncomfortable reality of bias and the supreme dignity of a young man who knew that the camera was his only witness. The heavy oak doors of the administration building clicked shut behind Jordan and his parents, severing the link between the sterile, conditioned air of the Inquisition room and the humid, chaotic embrace of the late afternoon. It was a transition that felt less like leaving a school and more like stepping out of a decompression chamber, where the pressure of the last few hours finally began to equalize with the atmosphere of the real world. The sun was dipping low, casting long, distorted shadows across the asphalt of the parking lot, stretching the silhouettes of the three figures until they looked like giants walking on stilts. There was no immediate celebration, no high-fives or triumphant shouts that one might expect after a decisive legal or moral victory. Instead, there was a profound and heavy silence, a quietude that belonged to soldiers who had survived a skirmish but knew the war was far from over. They walked in a tight formation, a phalanx of three, moving toward their car with a deliberate pace that suggested they were reclaiming their dignity with every step. The gravel crunched beneath their shoes, a gritty sound that punctuated the stillness, grounding them back in a reality where the threat of expulsion no longer loomed, but the memory of the accusation remained like the smell of ozone after a lightning strike. Inside the car, the silence persisted, but its quality changed. It shifted from the tense, defensive silence of the hallway to a contemplative, weary quiet. Jordan sat in the back seat, watching the familiar brick facade of the high school recede in the side mirror. It was just a building again. Red bricks, glass windows, a manicured lawn, but for him, the architecture had fundamentally changed. It was no longer a place of learning or social growth, it was a landscape of potential hazards where his very existence had been interpreted as a weapon. The final lesson of this ordeal was not found in a textbook or a lecture hall, but in the grim realization that his character was secondary to his optic. He understood now, with a clarity that aged him beyond his 17 years, that truth in this environment was not an inherent quality of his being, but a commodity that had to be manufactured, packaged, and delivered with irrefutable digital proof. The surveillance tape had saved him, yes, but the fact that it was necessary was the scar that would remain. He had learned that his word was currency with no exchange rate in the marketplace of institutional fear. Only the cold, unblinking eye of the camera held enough value to buy his freedom. As his father turned the key in the ignition, the engine's hum seemed to vibrate through the seats, resonating with the residual adrenaline in Jordan's blood. He looked at the back of his father's head, noticing the tension slowly leaving the older man's neck, the way his shoulders dropped an inch as they pulled onto the main road. This was the collateral damage of the black tax, the energy his parents had to expend not to nurture his dreams, but simply to defend his right to have them. The victory they had just secured was defensive, it was the prevention of a negative, not the acquisition of a positive. They had spent emotional capital to return to zero, to get back to the baseline of normalcy that other families took for granted. Jordan realized that the stillness he had maintained in that hallway, the restraint that the video footage had so beautifully captured, was not just a behavioral choice. It was a survival strategy passed down through generations, refined and adapted for the age of high-definition surveillance. He had become a master of the counter-narrative not by speaking louder, but by becoming so quiet, so undeniably composed, that the chaos of the system reflected off him like light off a mirror. This was the epilogue to his childhood innocence. The boy who walked into the school that morning, believing that following the rules was enough, had vanished. In his place sat a young man who understood the mechanics of perception. He knew now that he walked through the world wrapped in a context he did not choose, bearing the weight of historical fears and societal biases. But he also carried a new weapon, the absolute knowledge of his own discipline. The school staff had feared him because they saw a projection of their own anxieties, a phantom created by headlines and stereotypes. They had failed to see the individual because they were too busy watching the demographic. But the camera had stripped away their projections and left only the raw data of his dignity. As the car merged onto the highway, blending into the stream of evening commuters, Jordan closed his eyes. He felt a strange, melancholic power. He had stared into the face of the institution, withstood its attempt to rewrite his history, and forced it to acknowledge his reality. He was no longer just a student, he was the author of his own documentation, a young man who had learned that in a world desperate to paint him as a villain, his greatest act of rebellion was his unwavering, documented, and irrefutable excellence.